Welcome back to the Politics and Media Show. Is the government fiddling the unemployment figures? That's Labour's claim after over 100,000 of the latest 500,000 new jobs were revealed to be those who are on obligatory labour schemes for which the unemployed are not even paid. So should the Office of National Statistics include these claimants in the figures? Should they be forced into unpaid labour anyway? Well, with me in the studio are Murad Qureshi, Labour member of the Greater London Authority, Mohammed Amin rejoins us from the Conservative Muslim Forum, and Amna Silim from the Institute of Public Policy Research. Welcome to you all. So, Murad, what's Labour's claim here then?
Well, it's a methodological one, but it's an important one. Whilst the figures for employment may have gone up, it's clear that actually a high percentage of that is people on part-time and self-employed. So I think we've got to be able to break down the figures and see what they've got to say for themselves. For example, in the London context, we have actually, rather strangely, got less people employed than along with regions like Yorkshire. And I think that's a reflection of the inequality that we have in the employment markets here in central London.
I mean, Mohammed, what are the Tories up to here? They could have made a perfectly good news day by saying, look, we put on 400,000, not included the people who, by most people's common sense definition, are not in a paid job, and still had a good news day. Why lard it up?
Well, I don't claim to be an expert on international labour statistics, but my understanding is that there is an agreed definition with the International Labour Organization of how you measure jobs, how you measure unemployment, etc. And the figures that have been published by the government, by the Office for National Statistics, comply with the international standard. Now, if the government deviated from the international standard because it suited it, in this case it clearly doesn't suit it, but if it suited it, people will be complaining bitterly. Now, because it suits the Labour Party to say, let's forget about the international standard and apply this other standard, and by the way, it makes the government look bad. I mean, if you've got a standard, stick to it. If you don't like the international standard, get international agreement to change the standard. But it is important, if you're looking at employment and unemployment across countries over time, to have a single, consistent way of measuring it. And that's what we are doing.
So Amna, is the Office of National Statistics using the right standard? Because most people will say, look, these people, they're doing this, they aren't being paid for it, they're sent there by the Social Security and they won't get their benefit otherwise. This isn't a job in most people's definition.
Well, I think that the ONS is using the right statistic, but it's up to politicians and policymakers to accurately represent this information to the public. So when they say 500,000 jobs are newly created, they need to make sure that it is clear that 100,000 of those jobs are clearly explicitly labeled as being government back-to-work schemes, because the general public doesn't necessarily agree that an unpaid voluntary work scheme is going to be classified as a job.
So that's a fair point, isn't it, Mohammed? I mean, you were saying stick to the way it's calculated now, but even so, even if that's a fair enough point, the government should have said, and the way it's being calculated now, 100,000 of these aren't jobs by the way that most of you lot think about it.
I don't have any strong objection to that. I mean, facts are facts. The key thing is that what the government is doing is encouraging more people back into the working system. I mean, I've got personal experience of this, not myself, but with one of my sons. And this is in the days of the Labour government, so actually, good marks for you guys. After one of my sons graduated, for a couple of years, he didn't have enough self-confidence to go out applying for jobs. He was happy to live at home off me, playing computer games, and I couldn't persuade him to apply. But then I had a stroke of inspiration. I got him to sign on, and once he signed on, he was in the system. The Department of Employment, they sent him on courses about how to apply for jobs, they point how to interview, etc. And a little while later, he was always really dismissive of these schemes, but magically, he was then going for interviews, he then got a job, and from the time he got a job, he was going to work every single day, and it transformed his life. And that is what we need to do, not just for one person, my son, but for the whole country. And the schemes that the previous government had were not bad, but we're trying to improve these schemes with our present government. And in particular, by paying organisations for success. Not just do they get a person into a job, but is that person still in a job 6 months later, 9 months later, etc.?
OK, well, actually, that takes us to perhaps an even more serious debate about the state of the economy and what's happening on the jobs market. Because, I mean, Murad, a lot of people looking at the jobs figures now say, look, these aren't stable full-time jobs that are being created. There's a lot of temporary and part-time work here. There's lots of people. All the evidence shows that there are many people who want full-time jobs who can't get them. We're talking about 0 hours contracts. We're talking about casualisation, and there's something quite strange happening in the recession. It's not mass unemployment, but there is mass unemployment plus even greater underemployment. Is that?
Well, it comes back to the whole approach to the economy. The austerity measures have gone too far, too deeply, and have knocked people's confidence, and it also knocks people's confidence in the employment market. I mean, I'm glad to see that, Mohammed, in your case, you mentored your son into getting a job. I mean, mentoring's got a part, but it's not the whole story. We know in London, for example, that you may have great centres like Canary Wharf, and youngsters around the place with the qualifications, but they're clearly in the wrong postcodes. There is something happening for them to not get the jobs in that citadel. And I think we've still got barriers like that which need to be overcome in a context where actually I don't think people are yet openly talking about these issues in a way that they don't feel vulnerable. Because actually going from full employment, let's say, to suddenly self-employment is actually quite a tough thing to do. You've suddenly got to do your own tax returns. You've suddenly got to keep up the front that all's okay and the balls are up in the air when actually it may not be, and it's a difficult set of circumstances for people individually and their families.
I mean, what about this? Because I mean, the people who are studying the economy have even developed the idea that there's a new class of people called the precariat. Precarious workers who aren't, stable in their jobs. I mean, there's a huge amount of this going on. Has the IPPR been looking at this?
Yeah, I mean, we're particularly concerned with people who are long-term unemployed, so people who've been out of work for 12 months or more. And we're also concerned about youth unemployment because we find that people who have been out of the workforce for quite a while, they find it quite difficult to get back into the labour market. So these are people that we think need particular attention by policymakers and politicians. So at IPPR, we have something called the Jobs Guarantee, and that guarantees anyone who's been out of work for 12 months a paid job paid at the national minimum wage, and that kind of ensures that they have that recent experience and that they have some experience on their CV, because we find that people who have recent experience are more likely to find jobs.
And what about the underemployment aspect of this? Do you think that this is introducing, as Murad was perhaps suggesting there, sort of a level of kind of stress, of instability, of volatility into the entire society, not just among those people who are directly affected? No,
definitely. I think that there are issues with mental and health well-being with this, because, people are looking for work, and when they find work, they find that it's part-time unemployment, but they're looking for full-time unemployment. So this definitely does, bear down on their day-to-day experiences. It's very important to get people into long-term sustainable jobs.
I mean, Mohammed, what do you think about this? Because it's one of the more noticeable shifts in the employment patterns over the course of the recession, and it's perhaps a recession which is impacting in unusual ways on people.
I would say that what's probably happened, and this is an educated guess rather than sort of hard data, is that employers have recognised in many cases that losing people and losing skills permanently is bad for the business, but if the total amount of demand is limited, reduce hours of work by agreement with the people involved. And nobody's denying that the economic situation is tough. We've got a massive debt overhang in this country, both in terms of government debt and individual debt. We've got a Eurozone that is still in crisis, although, touch wood, much better now than it seemed to be 9 months ago. And in the United States, quite regularly, they create sort of almost self-created potential disasters in the form of the fiscal cliff. And that is not an environment that encourages companies to invest and expand. The economy, the shape of the economy is changing as we reduce public sector employment while private sector employment goes up. But it's a very difficult transition, and that is why there are so many people in the economy at the moment who are not able to work as many hours as they would like to work. And gradually, as we work through these problems, both in terms of domestic imbalance between government spending, government debt, private sector debt, as the Eurozone hopefully improves, as the Americans get their act together, the world economy will improve, and that will also help us here.
I mean, Murad, do you think that's possible when we're talking now about a triple dip?
Yeah, well, I certainly have got reservations. But I think what we've got on the ground is another hideous situation where people, if they are employment, not getting enough hours, and then they become dependent on the benefit and credit system. Increases government expenditure and also doesn't make the individual particularly happy. But coming to the greater context, I've not yet seen something convincingly coming from Europe to suggest we're falling into line with what China's doing, what Japan's done from last week. They've actually been in this situation for 2 decades with hardly any growth at all. Suddenly, the Liberal Democrats there go into power and they're talking about a fiscal reflation to take the economy up again, and we'll see what Obama does. I'm not convinced, but as long as he's got people like the Paul Krugmans of the world, I think there are people that can show him the light. I do think the austerity in Europe has not only affected us in the UK particularly, but certainly people in Greece, Portugal and Spain. And that's a whole emphasis in Europe has meant the European economy has stagnated in a way where people begin to doubt the benefits of the European Union, hence the debates we're having at the moment.
Well, Amna, do you think this is going to be a triple dip? And if it is, what do you think will be the impact on the kind of employment situation that you've been describing?
I mean, it looks likely that we're going to enter a triple dip recession. We're getting the first estimates this Friday, and it looks likely that it is going to be negative. The environment doesn't look like the economy is picking up. I mean, we are seeing employment going up, and that's definitely welcome. But, we're seeing this actually means that we're producing a lot of output, but we need more people to produce a lower amount of output. So that's particularly worrying. So, when we look ahead, the OBR has recently said that employment and unemployment is going to take a turn for the worst coming towards the end of the year.
I mean, Mohammed, let's just reflect on the kind of political impact that this might have, because I mean we've already seen in the autumn statement that George Osborne has had to say effectively, look, the forecasts were up the creek. All the austerity is going to take a lot longer than we thought about it, and that's got the government is in problems here, isn't it?
We inherited a situation where we were simply massively overspending in a completely unsustainable way.
Yeah,
and
but
continue.
Let's focus on this, because I mean this is what the Tories always say. But
that's because it's true.
But we're talking about the Tories revising their own projections about when this was going to be put right. So, all right, this is the point you're making. Fair enough point, perhaps, to make at the beginning. Not so fair now, perhaps.
Well, actually, it is completely fair. But on top of the fact that we had to have these cuts in government expenditure, we had to raise taxes, the rest of the world economy is less favourable now than it was in 2010 with the crisis in the Eurozone, which over the last year or so was far worse than it was in 2010. And in that situation, it's no surprise that George Osborne had to revise his forecast for tax revenue, and I don't think he was revising expenditure targets, because the key thing is to control government expenditure, because we were spending far too much. It takes time to work through this kind of massive debt overhang. The real problem was in the years when we had masses of tax revenue, the government wasted it. His government, that is.
Murad, this is an old debate. Let's have a slightly different debate. The Tories are in trouble. Is Ed Miliband's policy simply to, on Napoleon's principle that you never interfere with the enemy when it's in the process of destroying itself, just let them do this? Or is it going to be that the Labour Party is actually going to say something a lot more positive than it's saying at the moment?
It's invariably going to be the former, given being in opposition, and it's midterm, but we kind of nationally don't need to show how our budgetary effects will be of what we're going to present to the election in 2015 is. There's still time. All I can say is that in the context of London politics, there is clear choices to be made between defending public services and not, and I certainly will be doing that in London, as I have done this afternoon with the fire service, and probably do so with the police service. Those are the fundamentals, I think, of public expenditure. And I don't see what gain the Chancellor's made, because even his own city boys are probably, even if we don't go into a triple dip recession, are probably going to downgrade the debts and how much it costs to service the overhang of debt that we have invariably.
Amna, do you think that there's anything happening inside the establishment political spectrum that would address the scale of the problems that you've been talking about? Is there, I mean, apart from, all right, there's the usual Punch and Judy going on, but is there actually a substantive policy that can do something about it?
I mean, I think what we at IPPR think that when you're in a recession, you should kind of scale back austerity. You should actually be pumping the economy to get economic growth going. That should be the priority, getting the economy going. And then also thinking about the debt and all of the deficit, that is also a priority. But the first priority should be getting the economy going again. That's what leads to jobs. That's what leads to greater trade. This is what the priority should be. And I think that right now, what we're not seeing a clear, cohesive strategy from the coalition.
Well, I'm going to ask you both about this because that's a classical counter-cyclical response to an economic recession. That's after John Maynard Keynes, the economist who first came up with it. But the trouble with this is there are no Keynesians in the mainstream political parties. There aren't any in your leadership, and there aren't any in your leadership. So why not?
Well, let me answer that, because when I was listening to Amna, it reminded me very much, because I'm old enough, of 1980-81. And I still remember, I think there was 364 economists writing to complain when Geoffrey Howe raised taxes in the teeth of a recession. And they all said, this is crazy. Look how the British economy responded over the next few years after that. And my question for Murad is very simple. Ed Balls believes that we should cut the deficit at about half the pace that George Osborne wants to cut it. But every time the government comes up with a cut, the Labour Party is always against it. Give me one example of a cut that you actually support. Just one.
Well, look, I can only talk about the London context, and I said I've just come out from a demo, and I'm in support of the fire service because I think actually that's by far the most effective way of providing insurance policy that all Londoners can take for granted, so that when we have disasters like last week's helicopter crash, they're always going to be there. For what savings the Mayor is going to make, they're quite honestly peanuts, 7p per Band D property. Now, you can actually apply the same principles nationally, and I hope the party nationally can see the benefits of our strategy, because it would also involve making 500 firemen unemployed. I don't think that's does any good at all in present circumstances. What I do think there is some encouragement is if we go to other parts of the world where actually reflation has become popular. I think the Chinese were doing that last year. Will hopefully continue to do it this year with their own internal markets and hopefully open them up as well. And we've just seen the Japanese, after spending 2 decades in doldrums, suddenly it's dawned at them this is the only way out. So I think there's more hope to the east, so to speak, than the discussion we're having in Europe and in North America. And they will and let's face it, the world economy is moving that way, and that may not be a bad thing.
Amna, do you think that there's a danger here? I mean, because certainly in some sections of the country, this is a very large youth unemployment question, that there's going to be a kind of disillusioned generation that feel both locked out of jobs and probably out of mainstream politics as well.
No, I definitely think that there's a sense of what's happening, what's going to work, is anything going to work? And I think that especially with the youth, they're going there, and you've been told as a young person, go out, get educated. If you get educated, you're going to get a job. And this is just not happening for a lot of people who are well educated, and they don't see that there are any jobs out there. And of course, that's going to make for a disillusioned youth. Definitely.
I mean, lots of people at the time of the riots were, throwing up their hands and saying, "Oh, this is disgraceful. It's barbarism. It's, it's a feral youth and all the rest of it." But surely somebody should be able to connect the dots here. If you do this to young people for long enough, perhaps riots is one consequence. Mohammed?
If you look at who was rioting, actually, what's amazing is how many of them were associated with gangs, had previous criminal records, etc. I just don't buy this thing that the riots were a response to the economic situation that we have facing the country, which is a tough economic situation. I don't deny that. But I just do not buy the idea that riots were the response to that.
And what do you think about the larger question, Murad, of people being locked out of the mainstream political
I think I touched on it earlier, and I think we've got citadels like Canary Wharf, where there's clearly a lot of jobs. Youngsters who live immediately around the big estates, that Canary Wharf is, who've got the qualifications and yet not able to get the jobs. And I dare say there is discrimination there. It may be by postcodes, by name, ethnicity, a whole variety of things, but I think that needs to be tackled. I mean, the middle classes have always had their own ways of getting their sons and daughters into positions. It's usually the internship, which isn't paid and what have you, and hopefully opens a few doors. I think those kind of barriers have got to be dealt with as much as creating circumstances where businessmen and entrepreneurs are prepared to put money, take loans and set up businesses.
But about the political effects of this, do you think, I mean, for instance, that recent polls have shown that the number of people who are not voting for the two mainstream parties or three mainstream parties has now reached a record high at 15% or something. Now, obviously, that's not just unemployed people or anything like it, but that disillusionment must feed into those numbers.
Well, certainly. I mean, as someone who does regularly knock on doors, it's very disheartening to get that kind of response on the doorstep. And in their circumstances, it's probably not surprising, really. We've just got to make what we're saying and doing more relevant to their life and situation. Sometimes I think when we get involved in these discourses, it becomes very meaningless. You can emphasise local aspects, pan-London possibly, and then build on that to kind of look at it nationally and possibly globally. It is disheartening, and it is a task for all politicians to make themselves relevant to their lives.
Okay, Mohammed, you don't buy the connection between this and the riots, but do you buy a connection between this and disillusionment with the mainstream parties?
To some extent. But I want to come back to what Murad was saying earlier, because I strongly agree with him that discrimination is really bad when it happens. It needs to be stamped out. It's illegal in many cases. Certainly if you're discriminating under against the 6 protected characteristics in the Equalities Act, it's downright illegal and it should be stamped out. But there is a much bigger problem, which is one of self-exclusion, where you get people who are simply not willing to apply for certain kinds of jobs, or are not willing to travel even a mile away from where they live into an area where they feel sort of slightly alien. You get this with Tower Hamlets, where from the middle of Tower Hamlets to the City of London is maybe a mile or so, and yet people regard themselves as going to an alien place if they think of themselves as going to work in the City of London, and they need to break out of that mindset and also ensure that they're studying the right things in schools to make themselves more employable.
Amna, do you think there's a mindset problem, or?
I'm not too sure if there's a mindset problem. I mean, if that is the case, that's definitely something worth exploring.
What would you say the government should be doing? What would make a difference? I mean, you said about the sort of general reflationary policy. Are there particular things that you think it should be doing?
With respect to
solving the sort of youth unemployment, particularly.
I mean, I just think that we already kind of have a few schemes that the government is running, and those are definitely welcome, like the youth contract, but they're just not giving enough support. So I think that there needs to be wider support for youth unemployed and finding them the right jobs. And sometimes it is a matter of just getting them experience on their CV, but other times it might require a bit more support. So I think that this could be just expanded.
Specific policies over youth unemployment?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. The Mayor has had his mentoring scheme, but I mean the numbers don't really make a huge impact. There are only a few hundred when he was aiming to have several thousand, if not tens of thousands. And I do think there's a role there. I think we had a good instance when Mohammed with his son was actually helping to coax him into the world of work, and that can help. But let's be realistic as well. There aren't the jobs around at the moment and circumstances for business to take on young people, the traditional apprenticeships and internships that they used to have.
I'm going to stop you there because that's all we've got time for, but please do rejoin us on future episodes of the Politics and Media programme.